Hi, everybody. Welcome back to An Unexpected Fight, a pediatric cancer podcast. Today, Tiffany and I are very, very excited for our guest, who we have had many conversations with in the past, but not on this platform. So it was way overdue to have Donna Ludwinski join us here today. So, Tiffany, go ahead and introduce Donna.
I'm so excited to be doing this with Donna today. We've been collaborating now for 3 years, I think. Long overdue, like Kelly said. So, Donna is a dedicated pediatric research advocate whose work is deeply rooted in personal experience. Her son Erik was diagnosed with neuroblastoma in 1991 at the age of 6 and faced a late relapse before passing away in 2010 at the age of 24. Since then, Donna has been active and influential voice in the pediatric cancer community for over 3 decades. She serves on numerous national and international advisory boards and steering committees, including the National Cancer Institute's Pediatric Cancer Central Review Board and Pediatric and Adolescent Solid Tumor Steering Committee, the United States Food and Drug Administration as a patient representative, the New Approaches to Neuroblastoma Therapy Parent Advisory Council, and the Rare Cancers Research Programmatic panel of the Department of Defense. She is also a founding member of the Coalition Against Childhood Cancer and serves on both the Advocates Committee of the International Society of Pediatric Oncology, Europe Neuroblastoma Group, and the Scientific Steering Committee of the Accelerate, a global pediatric oncology forum platform. Since 2010, Donna has worked with Solving Kids Cancer in the United States, managing research programs aimed at accelerating treatment options for high-risk pediatric cancers. Since 2015, she has also supported neuroblastoma families and contributed to research initiatives with Solving Kids Cancer UK. She has co-authored numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters in the field of pediatric oncology and is passionate about mentoring the next generation of advocates. Donna holds a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering and lives in Virginia with her husband. They have 3 surviving married children and are proud grandparents to 9 grandchildren. Thank you for being here with us today, Donna.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. That's an incredibly kind introduction. I really am excited about being here, and thanks for the conversation. Just excited about all that you guys are doing.
I think your bio speaks for itself, how impressive you are and how much you're helping in the pediatric cancer community and all the different committees that you're a part of. When I first read it, I had to actually go through and Google all the letters so that I could write it out for Tiffany and I, because I'm like, we're not going to know what every one of these little
Yes.
letters stands for. You're part of all sorts of committees. So I think it's very clear that you're an incredible individual and for all that you're doing. So can you please start by sharing a little bit about your personal journey and what led you into the world of pediatric cancer advocacy?
Well, thanks for that, Kelly. The intro nicely explained my intro into the cancer world with my son's diagnosis in 1991. The interesting piece I like to always point out is that's before there was an internet. So we were in Boston, world-class institution, and none of us knew anything. I knew exactly 2 other families with the same diagnosis. So access to information was extremely limited. And thus, being the OCD, research-minded type person, I borrowed a library card for the Harvard Medical School library. And for the uninitiated, that meant looking in abstract books and then going to microfiche and paying per page to print out the papers. Now, the interesting thing is back then you're looking at papers of work that was done in the 80s. So clearly very, very old, rudimentary, very limited amount of research actually happening in these rare pediatric tumors. So the interesting comment I have to make about even all that effort was that it really didn't help very much with our decision making. His prognosis was extremely grave. They told us, a 6-year-old with high-risk neuroblastoma has about a 10% chance of living 3 years at the time. So we really did not expect him to last very long. So that was our reality. Was there any data behind any of the decisions that we had to make? No, there wasn't. I mean, you had chemotherapy, surgery, radiation. That was pretty much it. We did opt for a bone marrow transplant, which was not standard therapy. And it was kind of scary because they basically said you could really easily shorten his life, if you go through with this. But shockingly, he ended up surviving, and he kept on surviving. And so 14 years later, when he was in college, he was doing great academically, got a full scholarship for computer engineering. And at the end of his sophomore year, he became very, very unwell. And we were, absolutely shocked that the cancer had come back. So that began a 5-year journey in, trying to understand the disease, understanding the research landscape, understanding the treatment histories, like how they evolved. So I did basically that for 5 years while he was fighting. And we were all over the place. We were in 4 different states, lots of different hospitals, lots of different clinical trials. A lot of people would term that disease at that, in that population as an indolent form of cancer, but eventually the cancer wins. And so he passed away when he was 24. And throughout that entire journey, I had, like I said, I was very OCD about trying to learn everything. There were, tens of thousands of abstracts in PubMed for me to read, tens of thousands. At the very end of it, our, oncologist, who we loved very much and, stuck with us the entire journey, he came to visit in the hospital right that night that he died. And he said, "You can't let this go to waste." So that was the beginning of an affirmation that I needed to continue. The other interesting thing, and Tiffany, you are a perfect example of this. There are too many grieving parents who I learned later who the reason why they can't do this is because they can't bear something to work that wasn't available for their child at that time. And it's a kind of a fascinating phenomenon that there are some of us who wake up every morning super excited because something's on the horizon. And yet other families, that's just too hard. That's too hard. And so that's, kind of sorry, it was a little bit long-winded, but that's really how things got going for me. I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
I think the 3 of us share that in common, that type A OCD, scientifically minded mindset. So that's why we always have such great conversations, because we feel you. But I have to applaud you because I think I've shared with you, I did a lot of research when Riley was diagnosed and decided to reach out and get second and third opinions. And that's how I started this role. And so many people applauded me for doing the research and actually looking through on the internet, but I cannot imagine having to do it. You're the real MVP, because that is, you didn't have much to work with. So I think it's really incredible what you've been able to do and how far everything has come and developed. So I'm excited to dive into that more.
Me too. So, Erik's life has impacted so many now, with you being his mother and just going on and on to make sure that other kids hopefully don't suffer the same fate. And what lessons did you learn from that experience that continue to guide what you're doing today?
Well, I really like that question. Of course I do, because every single day I'm incredibly grateful that he got to grow up. Too many of these children don't get very far at all. And so that was a huge sense of gratitude. And he knew that. He knew that this disease takes, really, really tiny children. And so he had the main thing that I take every day, from him is his extreme compassion and empathy that he had for the little kids. For 3 of the years that he was fighting actively, he served as a camp counselor for little kids, and he loved every single one of them. And he was absolutely crushed every time he found out that someone had lost their battle. And so his love and admiration for those little ones was it's really sweet. It was a really sweet and genuine. In other words, he wasn't consumed with his own, obvious, knowledge of where this was going, but for all those little ones. So that was a big takeaway.
He sounds incredible. So you've worn a lot of hats, as we've touched on: parent, advocate, scientist, policy voice. How do you see those roles working together in your advocacy?
This is another question I really love, because walking into any kind of role in advocacy, we quickly find out there's a lot we don't know. There's so many pieces to this complicated system that we don't understand. I might know quite a bit about neuroblastoma, the disease, the treatment, the history of that, but I might not know one whit about the regulatory landscape, industry, mindset, even, clinical trial design and what goes into that. So there were so many pieces that I realized in order to be effective, I kind of need a working knowledge of a lot of these arenas. And that kind of comes into play with these multi-stakeholder platforms, which, we can all operate in our strength, right? In our area that's like, I'm super comfortable in this lane, but I'm not going to be as effective as if I can actually be at least conversational in some of these other lanes. And so that's why I think things started expanding quickly for me. Right after he died, I went to ASCO for the very first time, and I was like, wow, clinical trial science is a science in and of its own. And it's like there was so much lingo I didn't know. And then same thing with regulatory science, so many things I didn't know. So that began the journey of trying to fill in a lot of blanks. And that hence, these different roles pop up. But I will say one of the things I'm admittedly extremely weak in, and I'm not sure I'll ever have a robust understanding, and that is where policy and legislation meet. That's I have all the admiration in the world for people who are really experts in that arena, because it's something I just don't grasp very well. I know it's important. After the fact, I get the significance and the impact, but coming up with these creative ideas, that's something I'm very fascinated with, but not too strong.
I think sometimes policy and procedure don't make any sense. So I don't know if anybody really learns that landscape. I think it's just a bunch of guesswork, in my opinion. But now your role is with solving kids' cancer. And so tell us a little bit about how you got involved with SKC and what your role looks like today.
Well, when SKC was getting kicked off, two friends of mine who were the co-founders, Scott Kennedy and John London, their kids were fighting at the same time. And so we were on email and forums and sharing, looking for things. I mean, everybody was looking out of the box by then because our kids were in real trouble. And so out of that relationship, it was, a wonderful opportunity. I first volunteered, to basically just find information and, kind of look for leads for, promising research to fund. And then I came on board, part-time, then I went to almost full-time. But so I've been with them for 15 years now. And so it was truly out of relationship with the founders. And I also really appreciated their model that they conceived, which was, really kind of aggressively looking for unmet needs, really being careful to make sure that things weren't redundant, the kind of work that was being funded, pushing really hard for early phase clinical trials, because we can fund preclinical work forever and it not necessarily going to translate to the clinic. In fact, fascinating piece of data. If you go in PubMed, pick a tumor and then look at how many abstracts there are, then reduce it down to clinical trials. What you will find is anywhere from 2% to maybe 10% max are clinical trial publications. So more than 90% of all published literature is on preclinical basic science translation, all that, which is important. I mean, we know that's important, but it's the bread and butter of labs. And so their job isn't necessarily to make sure that those exciting things get to the clinic. This is where we come in, as funders and advocates and looking for really de-risked early work to make sure it gets to the clinic. So that's why we focus primarily on early phase clinical trials. But the same goes for that. You could fund early phase clinical trials that never work. You could do that forever, and they just have dismal, results. So you have to de-risk that as well. And that's when we started moving toward combination therapies and trying to impact frontline therapy. Because again, that's a whole nother, arena.
Yep, absolutely. And it's hard. It's a balancing act, right? Because you have to have some risk involved to find a new, updated treatment model that hasn't been tried, that's,
Mhm.
something that's outside the box of what we've already been doing for decades. But at the same time, like you said, you want to see them actually get to trial and get past that phase 1 and phase 2. So thank
Exactly.
you for explaining that, because I don't think a lot of people, have true understanding of clinical trials and why are some places funding preclinical research versus clinical
Mhm.
research versus, so thank you for that. This question, I've actually been really very curious for myself. So you've supported families through Solving Kids Cancer United Kingdom. What differences have you seen in pediatric cancer care and research between the United States and the United Kingdom?
This is such a big question. I will start with the positives. The positives are you have a system where everyone's on the same team. There are literally no competitors within the system. So within the NHS, you have 21 childhood cancer centers, and they treat every single child with cancer in the UK. Do they compete with each other? Absolutely not. They literally work together. So they work to make sure that children have the absolute best care as close to home as possible. And they also have national panels that discuss the children so that, the experts in each tumor type are really kind of focusing in on those kids. Downside is obviously comes, purely down to numbers. You have a population of, I think it's 80 million. So compare that to 330 million, what we have. Naturally, we're going to have a whole lot more clinical trials than they are. And not only clinical trials, but off the shelf options, things that are used off label. They can't do that usually in the UK. I mean, it's an enormous lift to get anything that's used off label. And then lastly, what if there's something, magnificent available in Germany? You can't just up and go. You have to pay. And to get the NHS to agree that that's an essential treatment requires an enormous amount of data behind it in order to for the government to agree to pay for that. So that's, kind of what's happening there. Very limited options, truly. But I'd have to say, in general, a lot of the best things are there. It's just a lot of the newest things that have no data behind them. Those aren't going to be available. So contrast that in the US, you have this crazy world of insurance and Medicaid and travel, and the burdens on the families in the US aren't small. To try to find the right thing and travel and get it. Sometimes, there's costs involved. So I think the two systems are very different. And part of it is just comes down to the compactness of a country and a system, that works really well within itself. Whereas the US is truly the Wild West, right? Anybody can start a consortium or start a trial, or you can get the funding, you can do what you want, and then that leaves families with this huge question mark: what's the best? Where do I go? What's going to work? So it's an interesting contrast, and honestly, it's been fascinating to work with them for as long as I have. I've learned a lot. There was an opportunity, for example, to appeal. NICE, it stands for National Health Excellence. Oh, I should know what this stands for. Something like that. It's basically their health technology assessment. And so there was a drug that was approved in the US, And they refused it based on cost because they do economic analysis, right? So as a charity, we were able to appeal the decision and saying that the way they analyzed it was not fit for purpose for children. The way they analyzed it was exactly how they would analyze a drug for, a 65 or 70-year-old, 4 years of extended life, what's that worth versus a child. So anyway, they upheld our appeal. It was the first time ever a charity had appealed, because normally it's pharmaceutical companies that appeal those decisions. So that was exciting. The bad news was, the company said, we don't have enough drug anyway to go into Europe. So we withdraw our application. But the point is, it was a real education in terms of how systems work differently, particularly in the UK. And then, in each country in Europe is a little different.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that and touching on that. I actually get that question a lot from families. They're presented here in the US with, I love that there's so many different options. I love that there's so many different consortiums. I wish we could all come together a bit more, but I think, having all this information and what is key. But you get families who all the time they'll come to me and say, Kelly, I was presented with 5 different trials. How do I know what's best and where do I go from here? And
Exactly.
that's something I try to help them kind of sift through the information as best I can. But it is definitely a challenge, even for those of us who have some understanding of that medical knowledge, because especially with a phase 1 trial, it's all new and there isn't outcomes to show you,
Exactly.
I can't.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So thank you for explaining that.
So kind of on that same line, why is it so critical to involve all stakeholders, so researchers, regulators, clinicians, families, nonprofits, and how does this advance pediatric cancer research?
I think that is such a key question, Tiffany, because we already know that if we all stay in our own lane, we have different objectives. We have different goals. And without, coming together and listening to each other, especially the families and the advocates who stand for the families, we're going to miss the mark, too often. We really are. Industry, sometimes there's assumptions made about, the goals, and same thing with the regulators. And yet when we all get in the room and discuss things, which certainly is kind of the heartbeat of the Accelerate platform, we learn so much more from each other. And then on the flip side is fighting for those opportunities. So for example, industry can sit down and decide they want, they either have to do a trial or they want to do a trial in peds, but they don't engage the academic community who treat these patients, and they don't know where they are, what phase of treatment they're in, like where does this fit best, then they're going to miss the mark. Likewise, if they don't involve advocates in their development plans, then they're going to miss that patient voice about what makes sense. So I've seen, for example, and I know you both have, where trials are conceived, they're frankly pretty toxic, and they also involve a lot of hospital stays. And so you're looking for a rare population who's going to have to travel to hospital and then be in hospital. Nobody, if you're opting for a phase 1, you generally don't want that kind of experience. You want something you can take at home, less toxic, good quality of life. And that's where there's, a complete mismatch in terms of what families want and, what industry is thinking. But you need all those voices. And again, a lot of times, first of all, clinicians aren't obligated to talk to regulators about drug development plans. That's not their job, right? But they miss an opportunity if they're not invited by industry to go into those early discussions with regulators, then they miss the opportunity to put their voice in. And I would go further to say, bring the advocates as well, because then everybody's in the same room and the very best designs will result, in terms of that. So I feel pretty strongly about that. I don't think we're there yet where industry feels comfortable bringing advocates. I mean, rarely do they bring academics to these early regulatory discussions. But I think it's just would be absolutely brilliant if they had the, trust factor with the advocates to include them in those, because what they'll do is they'll ask advocates to come and rally for them at the very end, like say at an oncologic drugs advisory committee. That's when they want the advocates to speak up. But they weren't there, 3, 4, 5 years earlier in the early discussions to find out what exactly was said and developed and agreed upon. So I think this is an area we can improve on, and I think it's moving that way. I really do.
Absolutely. Well, we all know that collaboration between these groups would be ideal. What are some of the big challenges in achieving this true collaboration across these groups, and how have you seen those barriers successfully broken down?
I guess a simple arena to touch upon is the fact that there's so much confidentiality surrounding drug development in general. So, right out of the gate, there's a new idea. It's all very, very, very hush hush. So companies are very, very careful not to share too much. So they're nervous about bringing advocates in early, not knowing, or is this, the confidentiality going to be protected? I think that's one area. I think, and that goes, it's not just advocates, it goes with the academics as well. So that's one area. Now, we've seen examples where that has been overcome because the companies themselves originate, heavily in advocacy type efforts. So we've seen that in a couple of examples just recently, where Day One Therapeutics, completely multi-stakeholder in terms of how it was designed and, built as a company, getting an approved drug last year. And then YMABs, same thing. They got an antibody approved that was deeply rooted in advocacy from the very, very beginning, and, the academics involved. And then third example is DFMO getting improved. And that was like a year and a half ago. Same thing. Very, very deeply rooted in the advocate community. So I think those are three beautiful successes of how trust was built early on. Everybody's on the same team. They all want the same thing. And so, very potent collaborations resulted, in approved drugs. So that's good.
I love hearing success stories about that, because a lot of times, you hear big pharma and they're not for the people, or, this or that. And it makes it so hard because you have to have R&D, you have to have this drug development, you have to have these clinical trials, or we don't get any new therapies. But I do think it takes a lot of work from advocacy groups saying, hey, don't forget about us over here. So can you share an example of where a cross-sector collaboration led to measurable progress with children with cancer?
Okay, that is a great question, because I'm going to be a little bit picky about the definition of measurable success. The reason why I pick on that is because we all look for metrics, right? But sometimes it's just how much money did we spend? How many research projects? How many hospitals? How many kids enrolled? How many, we look at those kind of numbers. But in my mind, the bar is very high. It is how can success be measured when brand new frontline treatments are succeeding and less toxic? So, survival rates are going from here to up here, and the children are having far less toxicity. Now, what does it take to get that? The sad thing is it takes a very, very, very long time. And you have to have your eye on the prize the whole way, right? You can't just, do a phase 1 and then hopefully it makes it to phase 2, and then finally it's considered for a phase 3, which we know, the funnel is pretty steep, right? And then you get to the phase 3, which might change practice. It might result in approved drug, whatever. But the point is it going to meet the bar of, not only improve survival, but less toxicity? And my beef with this metric is that sometimes it's short-term survival is deemed a success, but the long-term toxicities can be horrific. So I feel like this is such an overarching question that requires everyone to think about the long game. I really, really do. The short wins are not good enough. doing tandem transplants, pick the disease, or triple transplants, or, stem cell rescues. It's like that might do something in the short term, but the long-term effects might be, just so devastating. And maybe they're not even being necessarily captured. I know, yeah, it's just awful. The past couple of years, kids needing double lung transplants who survived neuroblastoma treatment, 18, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's a horrific late effect. So that's my bar of success. And so have I seen it? Actually, no, because how many of us have been in it that long? I mean, certainly I've only, been active in this world, the past 15 or 20 years. To say there was a group who was working on something 20 years ago and poof, it's now got this lower top. No, I should back up. There are examples. Rare tumors, new drugs, that there are examples of that. And I guess it's more the more common tumors that are treated very, very aggressively, and they're just barely eking out an improvement. The metastatic sarcomas, for example, no improvement in 40 years. And toxic, extremely toxic treatment. So that would be, say an area that's not so great. The tumors have an NTRK fusion that had remarkable responses to that new targeted drug. Okay, that definitely qualifies. But back to your original question, I do believe it takes a collaboration to keep the eye on the prize for the long term.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Absolutely. Now, we kind of touched on this a little, but what do you believe is most urgently missing from today's pediatric research landscape?
It's a hard one because you kind of flip through your wish list.
It's big.
Yeah, exactly. I would definitely put the need for, an army of younger advocates who are, in the mix. I think one of the really, really, really big struggles there are many people with the right aptitude, but they have a day job. And they absolutely cannot spend all their time on this. They can't travel. They can't, this all takes time and money, right? So that's a huge limitation for, I think, the army that could be active. Because the reason why we need that army is every time I'm, looking into an arena, like let's go back to the metastatic sarcomas, I need to know who are the advocacy experts in that world. That's what I really need. And they need to know it all. They need to know the history. They need to know the biology. They need to know really what are the unmet needs there so that collaboration can happen, to pull together, what's needed to solve that problem. So if I had to pick one, I guess I'd pick that one because I do think that would make a huge difference. But there's many other issues. We always talk about how the structure of academic research is competitive. And so the opportunity, for us as nonprofits and advocates to really kind of force collaboration, I've seen some laughable examples where we ourselves tried and it was like tokenism, right? Oh yeah, we're definitely collaborating with this other organization, and they don't even know what the research is supposed to be happening. So I do wish that there was a systemic change to encourage more. I think there is collaboration going on within the academic sphere, but not enough. I think it would be just so brilliant if there was an incredibly brilliant way to incentivize breaking down those silos.
Well, I'll say one thing about something that's not missing from the landscape is people like Donna who are out there fighting every day. I don't know if many of you know or follow me on my social media pages, but in February I attended a conference called Care for Rare that Donna and her team put together of researchers and physicians who were focused on ETMR and ATRT. And all of these physicians and researchers sat in this room they did a presentation, and then they do this talking back and forth across this huge room to come up with these ideas. And these are people from all over the world. This wasn't just people from the US, it's people from Austria and Sweden and, all over. And they come together and they did all this research. And now that they've submitted these grant proposals, and the Care for Rare team is going through to select one of these and fund some projects. So these are things that are being done currently in the pediatric cancer communities that may go unnoticed by the general public, but they certainly don't go unnoticed by moms like me or researchers. So that is an exciting thing. But how can research agendas better reflect what matters to families?
Right. Without, having embedded roles for the advocates, it's a little hard to guarantee. What's kind of interesting is in Europe, they're really advancing this concept of patient partnership initiatives. I think that's what it's PPI. I think that's what it stands for. They're really formalizing this, where it's like absolutely mandatory. And I think the US is definitely coming along at a good clip on this, but it's just spotty here and there. Like, for example, the dream teams that started back with St. Baldrick's and the Stand Up to Cancer, the big 14.5 million immunotherapy dream team. Okay, they mandated that advocates were involved in that. So that's, I think, a beautiful start, especially for some of these huge interdisciplinary type grants. I think the more that is advancing, I think the better we're going to get at doing what we're doing. But it also requires, support for the advocates. I really remember when I first signed up to be an FDA patient representative, I thought, okay, I don't know anything about the FDA. I know zero. And they did this beautiful training system. I think it was something like 8 hours one-on-one with a pharmacist that worked at the FDA. And I had required reading, and then he would quiz me on stuff and then say, do you have any questions? And it was fascinating because there was so much I had no idea. And so I think support in that way, in terms of identifying areas that we can fill in the blanks. We all, have plenty of blanks. I think that's going to strengthen those kind of roles going forward. I really believe that.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny, every researcher we've ever had on here, it says collaboration is the key, and being able to make it accessible to families. And so it's obviously a common theme, and I think we all want the same thing. So I think we're getting there. So
Yes.
as someone who has co-authored peer-reviewed publications, how do you make some of this complex scientific information more accessible to families?
Yeah, it's definitely a passion of mine. At the very, very beginning, reading, those 35,000 abstracts or whatever it was, I remember reading one and getting really excited. Oh, this looks incredible. And there were like 6 patients in it. And we don't even know really what the qualifications of, like, basically the characteristics of the tumor. So over the years, I realized you have to look, kind of at the source data. Translating things for families often has to do with what evidence is there and what does it mean? And does this even relate even remotely to your child? So that's one area of translation. The other area of translation often has to do with, kind of the overall pieces of the system. Because, like, for example, you'll read in the news, it'll say, oh, this trial is FDA approved. Well, that doesn't mean that the drug is approved. It means the trial can go. That's what that means, So explaining the different pieces of the system, I think, is important. A lot of us get super frustrated. Why does it take so long to get a trial open? Why on earth? Well, there's a long answer to that, right? All of the pieces that have to be in play before that happens. There was a really famous doctor in Germany. He called it regulatory related mortality. He actually coined that phrase. And, I heard, a doctor in the UK say the exact same thing. We got money, we got ideas, we've got patience, we're ready to go, but we have conflicting layers of regulatory issues that we have to fight through all the time. And, I've seen it firsthand, where, those kind of things happen, but explaining and translating that is really difficult, right? Because then, you almost want to throw your hands up. It's like, how is anybody ever going to fix all this? But it's all important. We have to understand the why. Why are there protections, of humans in research? That's an important question. I don't think we want to go back to when there were no protections.
Very true.
Yeah. So there's a lot to it, but it is, it's kind of, that's one of the reasons why I like mentoring the younger advocates, is because there's, it's more about, walking through the whole process than, just here, read that and you'll get it.
What's one aspect of the current landscape in the pediatric cancer community that you find most frustrating, and why do you think it hasn't changed?
Well, that's another really good question. I would say, even 10 or 15 years ago, I was super frustrated that it didn't seem like the nonprofit world worked together very well. It seemed like everyone was pretty territorial and pretty competitive. I don't believe that anymore. So that would be the opposite. I would say then I felt like, oh, this is such a mess. We should all be working together. One researcher once asked me, why don't charities, why don't they work together? Why don't they collaborate? And I said, well, everybody wants to collaborate as long as they're in charge. That's what everybody wants to do. Right. But so I think we've come a long way in that. But as far as what remains frustrating, I think, going back to the fact that researchers are not incentivized to share early data. They're absolutely disincentivized to do that. I think that would be an interesting change in the world. If that actually flipped on its head, I think we could move a lot faster. I really do. There are some bold initiatives where loads of researchers are coming together and just saying, okay, we give up. We're going to work together on this. We're all going to share our data and we're going to move fast. And I think those kind of initiatives are extremely promising, and I'm hoping we see more of that.
I mean, that happened at this conference we were just at. It was like everybody was really trying to be the dominant one in the conversation. And then they were all like, all right, let's pick this person to kind of be the head, but we're all going to be involved. So that was cool.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I agree.
NPCF does something similar with the research consortium that they have, the Sunshine Project. It's the same thing. So I think we are seeing it change, where these researchers are working with many hospitals and many fellow researchers across the country. They realize they can't get the data that they need on their own. They need to rely on each other, open trials at multiple sites throughout the country. I love that, your foundation's doing that our foundation's doing that. I love seeing that. I think that's really, really important. Now, do you have any ideas how we could work more effectively with agencies like the FDA to speed up the access to these promising treatments?
Yeah, I definitely have an admirable opinion of the FDA, given the long amount of time I've been able to see how they work, what actually is going on in the inside. So a great example of this is when DFMO was approved. It was historic because it was approved based on an external control. That has never happened in oncology, especially in that setting where it's proving a drug is preventing relapse. So remarkable historic event. And it came on the heels of an oncologic drugs advisory committee that everyone went into. I think whether you were for the drug or against the drug, everyone was thinking this is going to be kind of a blood. There's going to be some very strong opinions on both sides. But the part that impressed me is if you go, because it's all in the public domain, you go back and read the briefing that the FDA did for that ODAC, listen to the 5 hours of discussion. The vote was positive for DFMO. And then the team that worked on the analysis actually published a paper about 6 months later on the method they used to analyze the drug. That whole exercise was very enlightening about how incredibly serious the FDA takes literally every step of the process. And so what it told me is that they really are doing what they say they're doing, which is, obviously they want to protect, they want to show efficacy and safety. That's their mantra. But they also went out, essentially on a limb, instead of just saying we're never, ever, ever going to accept anything that's not a randomized clinical trial, which was published by leaders of the FDA just 6 months earlier. Like, basically, no oncology drug should ever be approved unless it's randomized. It shows, because they say in rare and deadly disease, they have to be flexible and lenient. And frankly, I don't think they were exactly lenient in terms of the rigor of their analysis. I thought it was brilliant. So my opinion is, how can we work better with the FDA? Well, first step is learning how they work, because I don't think it's that effective to just say, we want drug X as advocates. I don't think that's that effective. It has to be data driven. So we have to understand the process that goes into it in order to be a little bit more part of that, and maybe a little bit more inquisitive about how these things are being analyzed. But in general, I think, other than, completely reinventing the FDA, which I'm not sure is a good idea. I know a lot of people have very strong feelings about the FDA, like people in my own family who have absolutely no idea what they do.
Yeah.
Everybody has strong opinions about everything these days.
Yeah, exactly. I would truly believe that working, like you said, and it's not just, the FDA is a regulatory authority, but NCI, the steering committee for the Pediatric Adolescent is it childhood and adolescent solid tumor? I don't even know all the words. That group is essentially what is called CTEP. And so they do the scientific review of this COG trial. So anything funded by the NCI through COG, which is funded by NCI, has to go through scientific review there. That's a whole different level of regulatory exercise, is making sure that the science is sound, and, understanding that piece of it. And how can we work with them? Well, I would say to everyone listening, sign up to be an FDA representative, sign up, for the NCI roles. They're really, and the same thing with the DoD. There are roles for consumers on all of the DoD cancer programs. These are excellent opportunities to work with them and understand how they work better, and then influence, as you can.
So how do you tell a parent who wants to be involved in advocacy, or really anybody, if they want to be involved in cancer advocacy but don't know where to start, what advice would you give them, and what would make them effective and impactful?
Tell them, give me a call. I would love to have a chat. A lot has to do with the area of, kind of what aptitudes are there already, what baseline, areas that they can are interested in and want to contribute. There are so many ways to get involved in advocacy, and it's funny. I tell some young advocates, it's like, you have to define what you're really passionate about, and make sure you kind of focus, because before long, you're going to be asked to do everything. And then all of a sudden you're like absolutely overwhelmed with too many asks. So, that happens quite quickly once you get involved. So my bottom line would be really to sit down, analyze, how much time do you have? Like, you want a paid role, then look for, some of the organizations that really need advocates on the payroll. The nonprofits, a lot don't have dedicated research advocates. look for, because some families, some individuals are really interested in the family interaction, like you, Kelly. That's where their heartbeat is. And then others really want to be more involved in, does this science make sense? Doing advocate reviews on grant proposals and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different places to fit, but they really should kind of take a look at what gets them excited, what areas, fit the best.
Absolutely.
Love it.
I like to ask this question to almost everybody we have on the podcast because we hit on some really hard things and the difficulties that we struggle with in pediatric cancer and research. But there is a lot of hope as well. So, what gives you the most hope right now in the pediatric cancer space?
I love that question. I really do. Because I honestly, 10 or 15 years ago, I was like so depressed. Everybody's talking about targeted drugs. Nothing was working. Everything was toxic. It just didn't seem like there was like all the hype was going to go anywhere. And then gradually these combination immunotherapy type things were coming in, and people were thinking more and more and more about combination therapies, looking at treatment resistance and overcoming that. And so as time went on, I think everybody was waking up to the power of hitting cancer as many different ways as possible that is going to be effective, and again, thinking about less toxicity. So what gives me hope is, every day I'm seeing honestly amazing either concepts or early data coming out on something that everybody thought was a dumb idea. So what gives me hope is I think there are a lot of smart people working on these tumors. Tiffany, you and I saw the smartest people in the world, in the room, focusing on ETMR and ATRT and seeing how passionate they are. Like, we know they're going to crack this. And I think our role in that particular thing was coming together and recognizing these are understudied tumors, especially ETMR, especially. And so being able to, facilitate a gathering that they're all excited about, that they're happy that they were invited. They want to work on this. And then the grant call that came out of that was just absolutely brilliant. So that gives me a lot of hope, because if it wasn't for those types of, opportunities for us, that, essentially is a missed opportunity, right? So I really believe good things are going to come out of that, and likewise across the board. There's definitely some areas I still think need more focus, but I think it's coming. I really do.
I think so too. Well, if you had the power to change one thing tomorrow to move this field forward, what would you pick?
Yeah, I know a lot of us in the nonprofit space would say we need more money. It's easy to say that, right? It's such an easy thing. I think we need to spend the money smarter. I definitely think there's something to that. Having opportunities to be on grant reviews, like for the DoD, is a really good experience, because the one I'm on is for rare cancer. So guess what? Every pediatric cancer is a rare cancer, so they're all eligible. But I'll see things as like, wow, this was done 10 years ago. Why are they even, applying for this? So this is where, doing our due diligence and making sure that, really the best ideas are coming forward, and, not revisiting old ideas that don't work. I think the one thing I would change is, if we can't have more money, let's spend it smarter. That would be my wish. And I think we can do that. I think we can.
Absolutely. Well, Donna, if you had to leave one last message for our listeners, or maybe some researchers, drug developers, policymakers who might be listening, hopefully, what would you want them to hear directly from people who have been through this, families like yours?
I like it. I would definitely encourage industry, big and small, to not involve advocates in a tokenistic way. The patient experience is important. please, please, please don't let me miss the point there. That's very, very important. But there's another piece to it, and that is the input on, clinical trial design, drug development in general. Don't forget to include the advocates on that. I think that's important. And then, even for the academics, I think they're seeing more and more and more of that. The value of having the advocates involved in, let's face it, the drug development life cycle is long. And don't forget that advocates kind of have a role, can have a meaningful role in every bit of that life cycle. So that would be, just an encouraging message, is that it goes back to what you said, everybody says, collaborate. Let's collaborate. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Donna. I truly always thoroughly enjoy our conversations. You're a wealth of knowledge in every aspect, I feel like. And we really, really appreciate having you on here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a delight to speak with you both, and I really, really appreciate all that you're doing. This is fabulous.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for listening to another episode of An Unexpected Fight. We look forward to continuing to delve into research and talk to families, so tune in for another episode. We'll see you later, and if you want to contact us, our info's in the show notes.